Have you ever felt trapped by unreasonable rules that someone imposed on you? Sometimes, rules are not made to protect the community but to serve the interests of a few who like to control. But do we really have to accept them? Can we stand up, question them, and take back control of our lives? Today I want to share with you a story, a confrontation not only with a powerful HOA but also with someone who believes she can control everything. And the most interesting thing? This story has an ending that you will definitely want to hear. Now let's explore this story together. Don't forget to like, share, or follow so you don't miss out on interesting stories. When I decided to move to the Willow Creek neighborhood, I dreamed of a quiet life. A small house with a big yard, afternoons reading on the porch, and a dog barking happily when I came home. But on my first day there, I sensed a heavy atmosphere, as if the neighborhood operated according to invisible rules that everyone tacitly accepted. It didn't take long for me to understand that at the center of it all was Karen Thompson, the HOA president. The first time I heard the name was from Mr. Jenkins, an older man who lived 3 doors down. As I was rearranging the flower pots on the front porch, he walked slowly by, his eyes wary as he glanced around, then lowered his voice. "You're new here, right? Here's some advice. Don't mess with Karen." I nodded before he strode away, leaving me with a big question mark. But that wasn't the only warning. During the first week, I heard many stories about Karen from other neighbors, though most of them were whispered, as if afraid she would hear. Karen was not only a control freak, but also a true tyrant of the neighborhood. As president of the HOA, she had the power to make rules, impose fines, and even force families to move out if they did not follow her standards. Stories about her were so numerous that it was hard to tell what was true or false. She sued neighbors for planting the wrong flowers, forced a young couple to repaint their house because the color didn't match, and worst of all, forced a family to move out because they had a Rottweiler. Every time I heard a story about her, I found it both unbelievable and hilarious. I had lived in enough neighborhoods to know that some people were control freaks, but to reach such a level of domineering and tyrannical was rare. However, I wasn't too worried. I wasn't the type to be easily bossed around, and I had no intention of breaking any rules. The first week went by smoothly. I quietly explored the area, took Max, my husky, for walks in the park and enjoyed the fresh air. But soon I noticed something strange. The neighbors' eyes were always on Max as he ran around the yard. An old lady passed by and stared and shook her head in concern, and a man on a bicycle gave me a look that said, "You're playing with fire." Gradually, I realized that Karen didn't like dogs, or more accurately, she didn't like anything she couldn't control, and dogs, with their mischievous, unpredictable nature, were definitely on that list. I hadn't met her yet, but I knew it would happen, and when that moment came, I wouldn't be surprised, but I didn't expect it to go this far. Our first meeting wasn't like a casual conversation between new neighbors. It was sudden and distorted, and just as I'd heard, she came storming in with complaints and control that was hard to believe. That afternoon was peaceful, the setting sun casting a soft golden glow over the street. I sipped coffee on the porch, watching Max playfully play with his old ball. He didn't bark much, but when excited, he would bark a few times, completely normal for a husky. But clearly not everyone thought so. I realized something was wrong when a figure strode decisively from across the street. Karen Thompson, in a pressed cream dress, holding a file in her hand, her eyes as cold as a knife. Before I could react, she was standing at the gate, her high-pitched voice shattering the peace. "You do realize you're violating HOA rules, right?" I looked up, raising an eyebrow at her. Max was still running around the yard, wagging his tail, oblivious to the fact that he'd just become the center of an absurd argument. "Your dog is making excessive noise," Karen continued, flipping through a file. "HOA Rule 12 states that noise levels must not exceed 50 decibels between 5 p.m. and 5 p.m. This dog is clearly in violation." I didn't know if she had a sound level meter or if she was just making up an excuse to get in my way, but I didn't bother to argue right away. I just stared at her, waiting to see how far this show would go. "Also," she continued, her tone becoming more stern, "I hope you don't intend to let this dog run loose in your yard without a leash. According to the HOA's animal welfare rules, all pets must be kept under strict control and are not allowed to cause any disturbance to the neighbors. I've received several complaints from other residents about this dog disturbing the peace of the neighborhood." This amused me. I'd lived here long enough to know that no one really cared except her. I'd seen neighbors chatting happily as they walked their dogs, heard the barking of other dogs from the backyards of several nearby homes, and I was sure none of them had complained about Max. But Karen clearly didn't need a good reason to make a scene. She looked at me, her eyes piercing, as if expecting me to beg for forgiveness or promise to tie Max up and put a muzzle on him immediate, but I just sipped my coffee, keeping my face impassive. That seemed to make her even angrier. "I'm going to take this violation to heart," she announced, her voice full of authority. "And if it happens again, I'll have to ask the HOA to consider appropriate disciplinary action." I could see Max staring at her, his tail still wagging, completely clueless as to why this woman was so angry with him. I chuckled but said nothing. I knew this was just the beginning. Karen Thompson wasn't the type to give up without getting what she wanted, and I wasn't the type to bow to unreasonable rules. She stood there for a few more seconds, as if waiting for a commitment from me. When she got nothing but silence, she snorted, turned on her heel and walked away, leaving one last warning. "You'll soon find out that in this neighborhood no one gets to break the rules without paying the price." I watched her retreat toward the house across the street, then bent down and patted Max's head. He licked my hand, his eyes sparkling as if he didn't care about her anger. I laughed. "Looks like we've made enemies with the most powerful person in this neighborhood, Max." And I had a feeling the real fight was just beginning. I knew the confrontation with Karen Thompson wouldn't end easily, but I didn't expect it to escalate so quickly. Just 2 days after our first meeting, I found a letter tucked neatly into my mailbox, printed in bold letters, "House Violation Notice." I picked up the envelope, pondering it for a moment before tearing it open. Inside was a page-long, carefully typed, filled with the HOA rules I was accused of violating. The main reason? Making excessive noise at night, which was completely unreasonable considering Max only barked a few times when strangers walked past the gate. I wasn't surprised. In fact, I found it a little funny to think that Karen would sit alone at night, frowning, notebook in hand, watching for the slightest noise coming from my house, just to find a reason to send a fine. But it didn't end there. 2 days later, the second letter arrived. This time, the reason for the violation was different. My lawn was too long. According to HOA rules, grass in the front yard must be maintained at a height of no more than 2 inches for the general appearance. I went out to check it out and found that my lawn looked no different than the surrounding properties. But it seemed that in Karen's eyes, my front lawn was the only issue that needed attention. I smiled, ignored the letter, and went about my day. But as I expected, a third letter quickly arrived, this time about the color of my front door. I looked at the words on the paper and laughed. The navy blue of the door does not fit the neighborhood's aesthetic. It should be changed to a neutral color. I glanced around the house. The left side of the door was dark red, the right side was green, and the opposite side was a blinding lemon yellow. If the paint color was the problem, why was I the only one being targeted? But I knew clearly that this was not about aesthetics or rules. but a personal war started by Karen. I did not respond to any of the letters, but the more I was ignored, the more determined she became. Within 2 weeks, I received 5 letters citing all sorts of unreasonable violations, from the location of trash cans, yard lights, and planters, to parking in my own yard. At this point, I wondered if she was making up the law just to make things difficult for me. Every morning, when I wake up, I open my mailbox like a bet, what other mistake will she find today? But the most interesting thing is not the content of the letter, but the way she avoids facing me after the first encounter. Not coming directly, not knocking on the door, just continuously sending letters, like a lord who rules the HOA kingdom from afar with papers and laws. I know her purpose clearly. She wants me to be tired, to falter, to obey her rules, or to leave. But perhaps she doesn't know one thing. I'm not the type of person who can be easily forced. If she wants to play this game, I'm willing to participate. I collected all the letters and filed them neatly in a cardboard box. Every page, every line, every ridiculous clause I kept. I knew they would come in handy sooner or later. Karen Thompson may have thought she was in charge, but she didn't know that the game was just beginning. Finally, Karen Thompson showed up at my door. I wasn't surprised, because I'd been waiting for this moment. The HOA fines for the past 2 weeks had been a test of patience, but I knew she didn't like just pushing papers around. Seeing me ignore every warning, she definitely couldn't sit still. That afternoon, as I was watering the plants, she approached, walking quickly, clutching a cardboard clipboard, her face stiff as if she were about to enter a battle. She stopped at the door, not waiting for an invitation, and said sharply, "You think you can ignore the flowers and do whatever you want?" I didn't answer right away, just put down the watering can, dusted off my hands, and looked at her calmly. Clearly, she expected me to be confused or scared, but I knew that this game didn't play by her rules. "You've had enough warning letters and nothing's changed." She scanned the yard, her voice harsh. "The dogs are still barking, the grass is too long, the front door is the wrong color, and you're parked in the wrong direction." I knew she was trying to sound authoritative, but something in her eyes told me she was losing patience. The absolute control she was accustomed to having over the neighborhood was starting to falter, and I was the main reason for that instability. "I gave you a chance to make amends," she said, her voice dropping, emphasizing each word. "But if you persist, the HOA will be forced to act. I can call a special meeting, impose hefty fines, even put pressure on the homeowner's contract." She wanted me to be afraid. I could see it in the way she straightened, the way she emphasized each word, as if I said it long enough, I would believe she had the power to do so. But what she didn't know was that I knew the rules of the game better than she did. I said nothing, simply watched her in silence. The way I didn't react the way she wanted me to was clearly bothering her. I could see a flicker of impatience on her face, a suspicion that perhaps this time she was dealing with someone who wouldn't be easily swayed. After a few seconds of tense silence, she let out a sigh, pulled a piece of paper from her folder, and thrust it toward me. "This is an official notice of violation. You have 3 days to make corrections, or I will proceed to the next step." I flipped through the paper, the threats neatly printed, the HOA language making it look legal, but I didn't see any clauses that could actually be used against me. I had studied the HOA's powers and knew she was exaggerating. Karen looked at me, waiting for a response. Perhaps she expected me to promise compliance, or at least defend myself, but I did nothing, just folded the paper, stuffed it in my pocket, and turned back to pick up the watering can, continuing my work as if she were not there. In that moment, I realized I had just struck a blow to her belief in absolute power. There was no fear, no resistance, just absolute indifference, and that, more than anything else, probably angered her the most. I could hear her breathing getting a little heavier, as if she were trying to keep her composure. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away quickly, leaving a tense atmosphere in her wake. I watched her retreating figure, knowing that the battle was not over. But now I knew for sure Karen Thompson was up against an opponent beyond her control. And for a control freak like her, that was her worst nightmare. As I had predicted, after her direct threats had failed, she had turned to a new tactic, which was to find a way around me, to get rid of me without ever having to face me again. Her campaign had begun subtly. I noticed the neighbors drifting away, the hesitant glances, the disappearing greetings, the openings of words and then stopping. I knew Karen had made her move, and it was not hard to guess what she had spread about me. My suspicions were confirmed one afternoon when I received a call from the property management company where I had purchased the house. The person in charge sounded confused, as if they weren't sure whether to believe what they were hearing. "We've received a number of complaints from the HOA today, specifically from their president, Karen Thompson," the person on the line said cautiously. "She seems to be under the impression that you're a tenant and not an owner. She's asking us to contact the real owner to discuss your violations." I almost laughed. So this was her new tactic. She believed I didn't have the final say in the house, and instead of bothering to argue with me, she decided to go straight to the authority. In her mind, I was just a tenant, someone who could be forced out if the owner really felt the HOA was causing trouble. I could just imagine her calling the management company, her voice full of authority, confidently declaring that I wasn't a good fit for the neighborhood and that the landlord should reconsider the lease. Maybe she even believed she was doing the right thing, that the place wouldn't tolerate people like me who wouldn't bow to her self-proclaimed authority. But there was a big problem with her plan. I was not a tenant. I was the real owner of the house. And the most interesting thing was that she did not know that. She was so confident in her power and knowledge that she did not bother to check the facts. In her eyes, I could not possibly be a landlord simply because I was not as docile as the other residents, not afraid or quick to comply with unreasonable demands. So she created a story. I was just a stubborn tenant, a problem that could be eliminated by going to the real authority. I was in no hurry to tell the truth. I wanted to see how far she would go with this confusion, what she would do when she realized that her whole plan was based on a fundamental mistake. She had been playing this game for so long, controlling so many people, that she had forgotten one important thing: that real power does not come from letters or threats, but from understanding and controlling reality. And her? She knew nothing. She was so confident in her knowledge, believing that she knew all the rules and residents of the neighborhood. If I had told her from the beginning that I was the owner, she would have had time to prepare a new move. But if she had been left to make mistakes, to make decisions based on false assumptions, the moment of realization would have been even more bitter. I didn't have to do much, because she had already gotten herself into the quagmire. I knew she wouldn't stop at calling the property management company. She needed a stronger action to assert her power. And as expected, just a week later, I received a new letter from the HOA. But this time, the content was different from the previous letters. No more vague terms about the height of the grass or the color of the front door. This letter was a formal request stating that the homeowner was required to contact the HOA board immediately to address serious violations involving the current occupants of the property. I read each line slowly, then looked down at the signature at the bottom. Karen Thompson, HOA President. I pictured her composing the letter, triumphantly convinced that simply approaching the real owner would force me to leave. Perhaps she imagined a wealthy, busy homeowner would immediately call the HOA, demanding that the troublesome tenant be dealt with. I set the letter aside and took a deep breath. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The next morning I walked into the HOA headquarters, a small building at the end of the block that I hadn't been to since I moved in. Inside it was so quiet I could hear the scratching of pens on papers, and sitting in the middle of the room, behind a large wooden desk, was Karen Thompson. She looked up when she saw me, and her eyes lit up with satisfaction. She must have thought I had come to compromise, to beg her to withdraw the penalties I was facing. She straightened her posture, picked up the file, and flipped through the pages as if preparing to give an important speech. "There you are," she said, her tone professional but forceful. "We've tried to contact the owners, but we haven't gotten a response. I thought you might be able to help us get this information to them. There are some serious issues that need to be discussed." I looked at her for a few seconds, letting the words hang in the air, then said calmly, "No need. I'm the owner." The room was silent, time standing still. Karen's face was rigid, her eyes wide, her fingers frozen on the file. I saw the defeat in her eyes. She understood that all her efforts had been based on a fatal mistake. She believed she had the power to decide my fate, when in reality she had no power at all. I was not a tenant under control, but the legal owner, someone her HOA was supposed to serve, not oppress. I said nothing more. I didn't need to. I just looked at her for a moment, then turned and left the office, leaving her sitting motionless behind her desk, eyes still wide as if she hadn't fully digested the truth. I didn't have to turn around to know that she was in a moment of utter confusion. The entire world of power she had built around herself had just collapsed in a single sentence. When I stepped outside, the morning air seemed fresher than ever. I knew from the start that Karen Thompson would never accept this truth easily. But from this moment on, she could no longer pretend that she had any power over me. And that, for someone like her, was the ultimate defeat. I imagined her mind reeling. For years, she had manipulated the neighborhood, imposed rules, and made the residents so afraid that no one dared challenge the HOA. But this time, she had staked all her power on a false move, believing that I was just a renter who could be evicted. Now, realizing that she was the one with no power, she was completely confused. I continued on my way home, walking through the quiet residential streets. Everything looked the same. The manicured lawns, the houses lined up in neutral colors, the cars parked neatly in the driveways. But I knew something big had happened, even if no one could see it right away. Karen Thompson had lost the thing she held most dear: absolute control. Hours later, as I sipped coffee on the porch, I saw her appear in the opposite driveway. Her expression was different from before, no longer the usual authoritative air or coldness. Instead, she looked like she was trying to calm herself, but her stiff shoulders and clenched hands betrayed the turmoil inside. She stood there for a moment, as if considering whether to approach. I waited, saying nothing, simply watching. For the first time since I had met her, she was no longer the one in control. I knew she wanted to say something, maybe an excuse, a hasty explanation, or even a half-hearted apology. But when she opened her mouth, nothing came out. For the first time, Karen Thompson was at a loss for words. Perhaps deep down she still wanted to try to turn things around, but she knew that anything she said now would be meaningless. She had abused her power for so long, grown accustomed to never being challenged, and now she couldn't handle being exposed right in front of her eyes. Finally, after a few awkward seconds, she turned away, leaving the air tense. Not angry, just confused and defeated. She was not the type to give up easily, but at this point we both knew everything was changed forever. She could no longer touch me. The next morning, I was not surprised to find Karen Thompson standing at my door. But this time, without the smugness or authority, she looked like someone who had just lost something important. even though she tried to appear calm. I just leaned against the porch, holding my coffee, and waited. I thought long and hard about how to end this fight. I could have ignored her completely, left her to wallow in her defeat, but I knew that without a clear warning she wouldn't give up so easily. People like Karen thrive on control, and when that is taken away, they will do anything to regain that sense of power. She looked at me, waiting for a sneer or a triumphant retort, but I didn't need it. My victory was too obvious. She had lost the initiative, lost control of my life, and most importantly, lost the implicit respect of the neighbors. I put down my coffee and walked slowly down the steps to stand opposite her. Max sat beside me, wagging his tail, feeling the victory too. I looked her straight in the eye, my voice calm but firm. "You were wrong," I said clearly, "and I think you know it." She didn't argue. I saw her fingers tighten around her handbag, a sign of impatience and frustration, but she kept her cool, still wanting to hold on to some semblance of dignity. "I don't mean to make things difficult for you," I said, "but I also won't let anyone abuse their power and try to control me." I paused, letting my words sink in. "And I'm sure you don't want this to continue." No response. Karen couldn't find a way to respond. I knew she wanted to sound strong, but the truth was that she had lost control. HOA rules, threats, and tricks no longer worked on me. Max gave a little bark, then lay down at my feet as if completely satisfied with the outcome. I sipped my coffee, enjoying the quiet of the morning. A real quiet, no longer threatened by unreasonable fines or empty warnings. I knew Karen would never completely change. She would still be that power-hungry woman, still trying to control others, but at least I was no longer in her sights. And for me, that was a complete victory. If you've ever been forced to bow to unreasonable rules, remember that you have the right to speak up, ask questions, learn the real rules, and most importantly, don't let anyone else dictate how you live in your own home. Because at the end of the day, control freaks only have power if you let them. And once you refuse to play by their rules, they're left with nothing but powerlessness. You may have encountered a Karen in your life, someone who tries to control, dictate, and threaten you with their own self-proclaimed rules. But remember, true power isn't in threats or paperwork. It's in the ability to stand your ground and not give in to abuse. Share your story in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, give it a like to let me know you agree. If you want to hear more stories about HOAs, crazy neighbors, or interesting legal battles, click follow so you don't miss out.